Okay, so let's get right into it. As we look ahead to 2026, which of the world's biggest economies are, really walking on a tightrope? Well, a recent analysis paints a pretty precarious picture of the global economy. And today, we're going to break down all the key risks slide by slide. And to kind of set the mood here, we're starting with this really stark warning from the International Monetary Fund. The big takeaway here is that the global economy is fragile. And all the warning signs, yeah, they're pointing in one direction: down. All right, so where are all these risks actually coming from? Well, first up, we've got to look at the world's largest economy, the United States. And what's happening there is, well, it's fascinating, but also potentially really dangerous. See, on the surface, things looked pretty good, right? As you can see on the left, the US saw some strong GDP growth back in mid-2025. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. Underneath all that, as financial analyst Gary Shilling warns, the labor market is atrophying. And I mean, that's a pretty intense way of saying hiring is slowing way down and layoffs are picking up. Those big headline numbers, they're definitely hiding some real weakness. So what's the engine behind that growth? What's propping all this up? It is almost entirely AI. I mean, look at this chart. AI stocks now make up a staggering 1/3 of the entire S&P 500's market value. That's insane. In fact, one Harvard economist figured out that AI investments were driving over 90% of GDP growth in early 2025. The US economy isn't just riding an AI wave, it's practically being carried by it. But here's the billion-dollar, or rather trillion-dollar question. What happens if that wave crashes? Economist Dean Baker just lays it out, plain and simple. The single biggest risk to the American economy is that AI bubble bursting. A collapse like that would just evaporate trillions in wealth, it would crush consumer spending and send massive shockwaves through the whole financial system. That is the number one threat. And, those shockwaves from the US, they would slam right into a European continent that's, well, it's already on pretty shaky ground. The story over here isn't a bubble. It's almost the opposite. Just this persistent, really worrying lack of growth. And you really get a sense of the problem when you look at the actual numbers. The IMF is forecasting global growth to be around 3.1%. Okay, but then you look at Europe's powerhouses, Germany and France, and they're just crawling along at 0.9%. That's less than a third of the global average. They are barely moving forward. So here's the crucial point. When your growth is that low, you have almost no buffer. There's no room for error. They are dangerously close to tipping into what we technically call a recession, 2 straight quarters where the GDP actually shrinks. As one expert put it, any serious bad news could easily be the thing that pushes them right over the edge. Okay, let's hop over to Asia and see how this all connects to this theme of global fragility. Because while the US has this new, shiny AI bubble and Europe has super slow growth, China is still dealing with the fallout from an old bubble that has already burst. And look, this isn't a news story. China's gigantic property bubble popped way back in 2021. But here we are, more than 4 years later, looking ahead to 2026, and the sector still hasn't found its footing. Can you believe it? Real estate investment is still shrinking, and that's acting like a massive anchor dragging down the entire economy. And it's not just the property mess. China's facing this really potent cocktail of problems. They're way too reliant on manufacturing exports, but at the same time, their own consumers at home just aren't spending. This creates a huge risk of what's called a debt deflation cycle. And that's super dangerous. It's where falling prices make old debt harder and harder to pay off, which then makes people spend even less. It's a vicious cycle. All these things combined make the Chinese economy, as one analyst said, very vulnerable as we head into 2026. All right, now for a totally different kind of risk factor, a real wild card, Russia. Its economy is running under some really unique and extreme pressures, making it another huge question mark for the global outlook. For years now, the world has been watching, wondering if Western sanctions would finally cripple Russia's economy. And so far, it's held on. But as we look towards 2026, that question is getting louder and louder. Is this the year it finally breaks? Yeah, Russia really defied a lot of predictions, didn't it? They had this war-driven surge in public spending that actually fueled economic growth in 2023 and 2024. But that growth, it slowed down sharply. And a lot of experts now believe 2026 could be that tipping point, the moment when years of wartime borrowing, plus new sanctions, finally combine to push the economy into a full-blown downturn. Okay, so we've got an AI bubble, stagnation, a property crisis, a wartime economy. These might sound like totally separate issues happening in different parts of the world. But here's the main takeaway, the thing you have to remember. In our crazy, interconnected world, no problem ever stays local for long. So let's just do a super quick recap of the big risks. For the US, it's all about that precarious AI bubble bursting. For Europe, it's the struggle with chronic stagnation, just not growing. China, still trying to clean up the mess from its massive property crisis. And Russia's wartime economy is being stretched to its absolute limit. You see, each of the world's major economic players is walking its own tightrope. And that brings us to the final, and maybe most critical, question of all. We've seen how each of these major economies is kind of walking on a knife's edge. But they don't exist in a vacuum, right? They're all connected. So in a system this fragile, this on edge, what happens when the first domino finally falls?